Howdy, folks. Today we're talking about the meta and what the meta is and how you should account for it while you're building for a tournament or just kind of constructing a list in general. So, very briefly, like I said, this is a series aimed at people who've kind of played games before, but the meta is generally kind of what is played and what the prevailing strategies are, just as a quick kind of definition, right? One of the things that I want to kind of hit on is that meta is always moving, and the meta for the game doesn't ever really exist as much as the meta for one specific tournament. For example, if everybody agrees at the moment that Night Hunt are the best faction in the game, but if nobody good turns up to a tournament playing Night Hunt, then that kind of is irrelevant. Just something to think about. You could maybe argue that, I say nobody good, like nobody even passable, nobody that could kind of approach beating you with Night Hunt. Something to think about. So, firstly, I think we should talk about local meta. This is like you and your buds. Maybe it's like at your local game store or in your friend's kitchen or whatever, playing games week by week. This is what I would refer to as my kind of local meta. I think people maybe have slightly different words for it, but maybe your LGS meta or whatever. This obviously doesn't really represent the games meta at large, doesn't necessarily represent what's going to be played at tournaments, although I've definitely been in metas and probably am currently in metas where games that I play on the week by week basis or on a week by week basis absolutely kind of inform what my tournament games are going to be like, because oftentimes I will play against my friends at tournaments. It's not that unusual, especially if you're aiming to do really, really well. Generally, your meta will end up strong. I don't think I've played in a weak local meta for literally my entire life, actually. Maybe when I've been abroad a few times. Anyway, one of the things to kind of be aware of here is if you play a matchup with a friend and maybe the friend's not as good as you or just hasn't really sussed something out in this matchup, you can end up playing in such a way where, like, say, for example, you're playing sort of like I do this and he does that. It's like, oh, well, he did that, so this time we play this game, I'm going to do something else. And then you end up kind of taking a series of decisions down a decision tree, and you get so far away from the kind of main line way that matchup would normally be played between two people that you can actually end up missing quite a lot of interactions that are important about a matchup. Just hypothetically, say there's a matchup where the kind of common or garden way to approach it would be just alpha strike your opponent on turn one and hit them as hard as you can and hope that it works out. And maybe you and your friend played that a few times and it worked out once, but 3 times it didn't. And actually that was just because of poor dice, but it means that you and your friend have started to veer away from that approach in the matchup. And even if it is technically the correct way to play it, you can end up going all the way down this rabbit hole, and then when you finally get to a tournament, you get absolutely blindsided by some guy who just all-ins and it works, because actually it's like 65% to work and you should have been kind of playing around that the whole time. Something to think about there. You've got to not put too much stock into games that you play over and over and over again, because you can end up doing some very, very strange things. Similarly, though, if you and your friend are playing correctly, then you can get to a tournament and somebody will do something and you'll be like, that's a huge mistake, but they don't even know because they don't have 100 reps in this matchup like I do. And then you can just crush them. So it definitely goes both ways. It's just obviously in general when it comes to this stuff, I would be cautious of the worst case. And then if the best case happens, great. Similarly, your tournament meta. This is also not really representative of the game meta. Like I said, if nobody turns up with Night Hunt, then does it matter that Night Hunt are the best faction in the game and everybody's teched for Night Hunt for nothing? So, the meta in a tournament generally is, I think every tournament probably has a fairly unique meta. Sometimes the game, especially I think as we get further into the edition, the game will get more and more solved and people will start to bring what people kind of think is good. At the moment, it's sort of the Wild West. People are finding new, strong things all the time. Tzeentch is on the kind of up and up. Feck are secretly good, and I will die on that sword. Die on that hill. Die on that hill, that's the phrase. There's, I don't know, loads of stuff. OBR are having, like, people were originally like, oh my god, Katakros and 30 Death Raiders, that's incredible. But now people are Nagash and 30 Death Raiders, but now people are starting to play Katakros, and he's also performing quite well. There's a lot of things in the game that I think that he bullies. Maybe he's not the best singles army, but he's definitely strong in a team's environment. Anyway, so I think that you've got to understand that the tournament that you're teching for is unique. If your kind of national scene will be influenced by what people bring to tournaments. If lots of people bring, say, Stormcast, say you turn up to a tournament and literally half of the players there are playing Stormcast, then next tournament people are probably going to bring some Stormcast tech. They're probably going to be teching for Stormcast, and this can kind of lead your meta down a little road, similarly to what we were talking about with the local meta, where you can end up kind of straying away from the kind of international meta, if you will, and what people are going to play at things like Worlds and kind of other big tournaments. This, however, is generally what people will do, and what almost every AoS player is taking for their own, maybe national, maybe kind of like local-ish, maybe like within 2 hours drive tournaments meta. That's generally what people are building for, and that's something that you can also account for when you're making your own lists. You should do this, but you should also be aware that everybody else is doing this when you go to a tournament. So, speaking of yourself, knowing your own place in the meta matters. Generally, for pretty much my entire life, I've been like one of the sharks, right? I have always really enjoyed playing to win and min-maxing, and usually I am somebody that people are attacking for. Knowing if you're the guy people are attacking for is kind of important, because if you turn up and you have you've been playing some dumb skew list for idiots, say hypothetically you were playing an army with 30 wind chargers and 3 foxes, and literally nothing in the army can deal more than 6 damage to anything reliably, hypothetically, and somebody was to turn up with a bunch of 1-up save capable OBR with -1 to wound from shooting. In theory, you would get crushed. Similarly, if you're playing an all-in Alpha Strike melee list and you play against something that just has the absolute nuts anti-melee tech, some, Zinch list that's going to summon a spawn on you reliably, top of 1, and you just don't get to move, and then you get pinned down and bogged down all game and things like that. Basically, I think that if you know that you're the big dog in your local meta, you need to bring an all-rounder. You can't bring skews unless you're happy dodging people attacking for that skew. Or the skew is so powerful that it can play through the tech. And that does happen sometimes. I would say Old Soulblight were an example of that, where it did not matter how much anti-horde you brought. Soulblight were just so powerful that they would beat you anyway. So, that's, speaking as a player, understanding your faction's place in the meta is also really important. At the moment I'm playing Lumineth. I would say Lumineth are one of the best factions in the game. I think that they're worse than Nighthaunt. I think almost every faction is worse than Nighthaunt, although I think they have a reasonable matchup against Nighthaunt. They're just worse against the field at large. And understanding, that people are going to be teching for Lumineth, and as a result, you should probably be careful. If Techless is super popular, then you probably shouldn't bring Techless, right, to a tournament that you really, really want to win, because people will be like, Techless is really popular, and this person that I'm worried about having to play likes to play Techless. Maybe I should put some extra, crossbow. What are those Stormcast crossbow guys? Vanguard hunters with long straight crossbows? Them? Or maybe I put in an extra fox to my Lumineth list for the mirror and things like that. Stuff to definitely think about and be careful of is if you're playing kind of a big bad faction, say you're playing Nighthaunt, everybody is going to be attacking for you. People know that you're playing the best faction in the game. Similarly, if you're playing something like, Ideneth or Fireslayers or something like that, where there's not really much hubbub or anything about your faction. If you're out there just playing honest man's corn, nobody's attacking for you. You might get caught in the crossfire if your army style is similar to one of the kind of top dogs. Say, for example, you're playing a ton of shooting in some kind of smaller army that maybe it gets caught up in crossfire when people are bringing anti-shooting tech for Lumineth. Stuff like that can happen, but generally if you're playing a kind of underdog faction, nobody's teching for you, and you would only be teched for if people know that you're a good player. which is something that you definitely do have to keep in mind when you're constructing your list. That's why I would suggest building an all-rounder. Anti-meta is something I want to touch on really, really quickly. I don't think anti-meta exists in Age of Sigmar. I don't think I've played through Age of Sigmar where there's been a meta so prevalent, like, as in a playstyle within the meta that's so prevalent that you could actually feasibly bring an anti-meta list. I think it's like a buzzword that sounds good that people have copied from other games like Magic the Gathering. On the right there, that's Rest in Peace. That actually can be an anti-meta card in Magic the Gathering. If there's a format, like a block format or whatever, or just like a season or something, where, say, every single good top tier deck is using the graveyard in some capacity, Rest in Peace is an anti-meta card. This kind of thing doesn't really exist in AoS. The closest thing I could think of off the top of my head was Aura of Sterility in OBR. That's the first thing that came to mind. That's the -1 to wound rolls from shooting if you target things wholly within 12 of the person with the heroic trait. That is, if, say, you could imagine where, like, you know, the best factions are like LRL all guns, Daughters of Cain all guns, Cruel Boys all guns, Cities all guns, you know, Caradrot Overlords just obviously all guns, you know. Maybe this would be an anti-meta choice, but I sort of don't think that there's anything, there just isn't hate in this game the way that there is in other games. Anti-meta is more of a card game thing, I think. I can't imagine anything like this ever existing in AoS. Even when I first started the game, shooting was oppressive. That was when Seraphon kind of castling and just murdering you with shooting and spells was really strong, as well as LRL Lambent Light stuff, Helon and all that. It's still like, teching for the good factions just isn't the same as anti-meta. It's kind of just not a thing. There's no, like, that none of your models can be shot rules or whatever. You could maybe argue that in that meta that IDK would be an anti-meta faction because of how much anti-shooting tech that they had at the time. I think they've stripped back on that now in 4th, but it's just not the same. It's not the same thing. And I just wanted to touch on that really quickly because I think anti-meta is fake, but I also see it thrown around a lot by people that want to sound smart. So, yeah, no, not a real thing, I think, in AoS. Okay, anyway, so to go back to where we were at the end of this slide, sorry, I just wanted to slide that in real fast. I think that one of the things that I touched on here is you want to kind of round out and bring an all-rounder. Here I want to talk about the 45%. So this is my favorite way to play war games, and it kind of always has been. I hate dodging. I have always hated dodging. When people tell me, oh, don't worry about it, just dodge that matchup, what will invariably happen is I end up playing a matchup that I have literally no hope of winning, and it's the semi-finals of the Scottish Masters, and I'm playing against one of the best players in the entire world, actually probably the best player in the entire world, and it's literally unplayable because I didn't bring tech for this matchup. I would much, much rather round out my armies, have a 45%er, and just be able to play a game. You know, I think that, to me, there is nothing more infuriating than hitting the bad matchup and just losing. And there's not really an out for you. You could argue that in AoS, maybe there's always an out, but I think some matchups, there probably isn't, really. You know, if you were playing like old Disciples of Tzeentch that relied on killing people with spells in 3rd, and you hit Null Myriad with a 2-up spell ignore, you don't have what Seraphon have, where they can just summon a ton and play through that matchup. You're just going to get bodied. So I think that there are definitely binary matchups in AoS, but usually they're opt-in. Generally, you're the one in charge of what you take to a tournament. So if you build a matchup in such a way that it is really, really bad for you, or build your list in such a way that there's a matchup really, really bad for you, you could argue that that's sort of on you. Some factions, maybe they just can't build to have a favourable matchup against certain things, but for example, playing at LRL, I've actually found that my hardest faction matchup is Feck, just due to the way that Feck work. LRL have a really hard time LRL are excellent at sandpapering, right? They will chip away at people. Feck and Lords of the Manor have incredible recursion, and generally do not care about being sandpapered down. You need to all in and kill one of their units, and LRL have a really hard time doing that. So, when I build my lists, I think about Feck, because, and maybe this sounds conceited or whatever, but I think I could very easily lose to somebody who is worse at the game than me if they're playing a strong Feck list. Nighthaunt are the same, where I I'm not favored against, or I think LR will have an okay matchup against Night Hunt, but that army is so powerful that you can easily lose to somebody worse than you with most other factions. So you should build for stuff like that, and you should kind of account for things like that. So there are people out there who like to build and just kind of lean into their own army's strengths. That would be something like, I don't know, KO, and they're looking to table somebody on turn 2 with guns in third. That's valid, but if you run into that guy who just has like an unshootable army, you lose. So I hate doing that, and I've always hated doing that. I would much rather build to have a 45% against everything and look to outplay everybody. That, to me, is a much more consistent way of playing. That being said, if you are maybe in the kind of middle of the road of your Age of Sigmar journey and you're not as good as the people at the top, totally valid to bring a skew list and just be like, yeah, if I'm playing like my all guns KO list and I hit the guy playing Ideneth literally can't be shot army, or Cruel Boys literally can't be shot army or whatever, yeah, I lose. But if I don't hit that, maybe I'll take some games off of people who are better than me, and also this can kind of propel you to get up to the top tables, so you get to play against those people who are better than you, and then that's where the real learning happens, I think, is getting absolutely embarrassed by somebody who's better than you at the game. You will never learn as much from losing. Or you will never learn as much as from losing, excuse me. Generally, building for the 45%, the way that you'll accomplish that is taking out... So the example I'd used was a KO army that just alpha strikes people off the board with guns. If you wanted to round that army, obviously you're taking out some of the guns, right? You got to get rid of some of the guns, you got to put in some melee presence. Traditionally, back in the olden days, that was maybe like Gotrek or some of those weird... Is it Endrin Riggers? The charge guys? Or like some Arcanauts or something to get some board presence, that kind of thing. In LRL, maybe you don't play like literally nothing but Huracan models, but you put in like, I don't know, Dawn Riders or a Cow or 30 Riverblades or something like that. Just, there's a lot of stuff that you can do there, I think, to kind of account for the 45%ers, or sorry, turning the 30%ers into the 45%. So to recap, overall meta, not really a thing. What you're teching for is the meta going to a specific tournament. You're teching for the players going to a specific tournament. If there's people that you're going to have to beat probably to win that tournament, tech for them. Something else I just wanted to mention in this video is I personally have always believed in advancing like the game as much as possible. I've never really condoned hiding lists, information strategies. I think people that kind of obfuscate and conceal things like that for their own advantage are cringe. And I've kind of always thought about that. People that I've run into in this game usually get kind of like blindsided when I'll just come up and start talking to them about matchups, and they think that I'm like trying to pry or something, or like get some kind of advantage over them for like some tournament that's going to happen in 9 months when the entire meta is going to be completely different. I don't care. I just want to talk about the game and learn new things and improve and refine. I don't know, maybe that's like the autism talking or something, but I've never understood this need to hide information and have like an advantage for one tournament and stuff, when we could just make the game better for everybody and look to beat people at the game because we're better at the game than them, rather than some kind of weird cloak and dagger thing. Just something I wanted to throw in there because I think it's relevant to the meta kind of conversation. So that being said, tech for tournaments, get as much information as you can, know who's going, know what they're probably going to be playing. Don't tech for like, don't go super hard like murdering your other faction matchups and stuff, teching for Night Hunt if you know nobody is going to a tournament with Night Hunt. With that being said, don't have absolutely zero game into Night Hunt and then complain when somebody turns up with Night Hunt and you get matched into them and lose. You can't. Just the same way that I would say, you should try your best to not have like an 80%er matchup if it means that you have a 20%er matchup. Don't have a 20% matchup in the first place, right? Like that's just as bad as leaning really hard into like this kind of skew thing is if you still just can't deal with certain factions. Obviously, some factions, maybe your faction matchup is so bad that there's nothing you can do about it. I'm not sure I believe that, but it's possibly true. So don't get blindsided by these people playing factions you've never seen before. If somebody plays IDK at my next event, it's going to be my first ever game against them in fourth, and I'm going to have to learn what they do on the fly, but, I'm going to go read their cards and make sure that I don't think, well, I've already done that, and I don't think I completely, like, lose to them, and I think that that's an important thing to do, right? It's the only faction that I haven't played against yet in fourth. if there's stuff that you know you don't really know what it does, go make sure it doesn't just have some rule in there, and like look up some lists that people are playing and stuff. Make sure that they don't have some artifact that's like remove all Gloomspite gets Hobgrot units or Boingrot units wholly within 12, and your Boingrot spam is dead. You know, just make sure that you have a game into everything people are playing as much as possible to your ability. Hopefully this has been helpful. I think this is a interesting and difficult subject to kind of pin down because it's so varied. Depends so much on your local meta. But thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.